Hello, Fox Fairy, where I talk about marginalized subjects from a marginalized viewpoint, while I learn to draw. Hello, in this video I will be discussing the pros and cons of being an inclusionist or an exclusionist. I will go through all of the different independent things that make being exclusionist more difficult or more fulfilling, and all of the things that may make being an inclusionist easier or more fulfilling in their own right. Let's start with numbers. An inclusionist may feel much more comfortable in their community because they make up the vast majority of people who are aware of discourse, and outside of people who are aware of discourse, the opinion is the majority. Whereas an exclusionist may feel less at place in any space because we are a very small group of people, and oftentimes we become marginalized by the larger groups of opinions, mostly held by inclusionists. So, in numbers, we're going to give 1 point to inclusionists. Up next is evidence. On evidence, on the inclusionist side, most of their evidence is superficial front page definitions from websites that got their definitions from politically correct sources. People just saying that they'd prefer the definition of gender to be one thing over another. And exclusionists have lots of studies and research dedicated to exclusionist topics. A lot of resources and articles on the exclusionist side have supported the arguments such as gender is not a social construct and that gender has something to do with the construction of your brain. They even have some theories that are based around being non-binary, and they have a robot that can predict your gender identity with a pretty good accuracy rate. On the inclusionist side, they have no scientific studies, and they have nothing but social studies. In my opinion, sociology does not outweigh any other kind of major field of science because it's solely dependent on individual people and cultures and doesn't do any physical research on the inside of someone's body. So I would say that's 1 point to the exclusionists. Up next is unification. On the inclusionist side, there aren't any subcommunities, really, and they don't really label their radicals because they don't have any particular opinions based around being a radical. So inclusionists are all one unified group. They don't label any differing opinions because they don't have any differing opinions. So there would be nothing to separate. On the exclusionist side, we do struggle with unification. Exclusionists tend to be hostile to other exclusionists if they differ on an opinion that is really important to them. Thus, why we have so many subcommunities: True Scum, transgender communities, Nunchuck non-binary, Longsword lesbian, Gravity knife gay, Battle axe bisexual, and there are a few more too. All of these different opinion bases having specific name because the differing opinions were needed due to the lack of unification. We couldn't all just agree on one thing, and a lot of that is mostly because if you are leaving the inclusionist community because of your one exclusionist opinion, because oftentimes you get shooed out of their spaces and forced into the exclusionist community by inclusionists, you don't necessarily mesh with the exclusionist community entirely because of that one opinion. A lot of us do integrate and start gaining more exclusionist opinions as we go on, obtaining the entire set of opinions, but not all of us do because we didn't choose to be exclusionists. That was just what we believed, and we were made to be exclusionists by not being inclusionists. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a neutralist, but neutralists can fall under any exclusionist group of opinions. You can be a neutralist and be a Gravity knife gay or a transmed, as long as you don't agree with the majority of exclusionist beliefs. So yes, exclusionists are very ununified, and we are very separated in the way we act and the way we think. We're very different from each other, whereas inclusionists normally share an entire opinion base. They're very unified, sort of like a hive mind, but they don't struggle with the separation issues that we have, making it harder for us to congregate. Next up is representation. Which side of the discourse community is represented better in the mainstream media? Considering the mainstream LGBT community by default follows the inclusionist community until they find themselves having an opinion that exposes them to exclusionist beliefs, inclusionists have the best representation. They are your automatic default if you're not aware of discourse in the first place, because you'll just go along with whatever everyone else is saying. And what everyone else is saying is that gender is a social construct, and that you can do whatever you want. A lot of people who don't question it and just want to be here for the ride. On the exclusionist side, our arguments are not well represented. A lot of people say that exclusionists exclude non-binary people from being trans and from even being valid, especially against trans meds, because the well is so poisoned against us. So we don't get to represent our arguments to the mainstream media without them assuming that we are representing them wrong in order to sway them, or that we are trying to target their particular beliefs to indoctrinate them into our subcategory of beliefs within the community. It can be difficult to talk to someone, especially if a trans medicalist, for example, says that they're trans medicalist in a public space, but they say that they don't think that you have to transition, and they don't think that non-binary people aren't valid and aren't trans, and that they don't think that it's wrong for a non-binary to transition, then people in that public space would say that they aren't trans medicalists, even though they are the only ones who know what a trans medicalist really is, being in the community. Our voices are really silenced in that. We can't really get our opinions out there because inclusionists will always silence us by brigading or poisoning the well. Oftentimes, if an exclusionist wants to speak about their opinions, they get bullied, harassed, doxxed, told to hurt themselves, or something like that, all the time. A lot of us just end up hiding or going silent because it's easier to just not speak up than to receive mass harassment. So that's one point to inclusionists. Up next is the comfortability side. Which group is it more comfortable to be a part of? On the inclusionist side of the debate, everything's going good for you. Chances are you'll never even make contact with an exclusionist unless you explicitly seek them out. So you won't really be participating in much discourse. All of the LGBT events and community groups will be targeted towards you, and you won't ever really have to worry about someone with a different opinion getting in your way. On the exclusionist side, your opinion is actively hated, and by having your opinion, people would disrespect you and harass you. And there's a guarantee that if you're open about your opinions online, you're going to get brigaded, and you're going to get mass reported, and you're going to get some sort of harassment, oftentimes repetitive harassment. So I would say that is 1 point to inclusionists. Although, as a sub-note, you would be sort of comfortable in the exclusionist community knowing at least there is some scientific or logical basis behind what you believe. Historical as well. Up next is radicalization. Which community has more of an issue with radicals? On the inclusionist side, radicalization doesn't have any particular identification factors. You can't look at an inclusionist belief and say that they are a radical inclusionist unless they include maps or raby gender or things like that. You would have to be very much out there, and until recently, believing that xenogenders are valid was considered more of a radical inclusionist opinion. Although it was way before the pandemic and other major events happened that it was considered not radical to believe that xenogenders are valid on the inclusionist side. By recently, I mean relatively recently. Radicals on the inclusionist side are people who are willing to harass, dox, or do any kind of other mental or emotional harm to an exclusionist to silence them or to prove a point. I've had many encounters with radical inclusionists. People have sent me gore without my consent. People who have sent me really, really nasty pictures and photos. People who have sent me my IP address. People who have sent me texts saying that they're going to hurt me or that they want me to hurt myself. And that, I wouldn't be able to explain it on YouTube or else this video would get taken down, things that they've said to me. And this is a normal experience for people who are open about their beliefs online as an exclusionist. And the fact that being an exclusionist means you are inherently going to encounter these people is a pretty good indicator that you are going to encounter radical inclusionists inside an inclusionist space as well. So they're likely a very large group inside of the inclusionist community. In the exclusionist community, there are radical exclusionists, and they are identified by which beliefs they have on top of the same key identifiers that the inclusionists have. A radical exclusionist would be someone who would be willing to mentally or emotionally harm someone else over discourse, or who does not support non-binary identities, or someone who does not believe you can be transgender but still not pursue medical transition, or someone who believes that transgender people aren't valid, or someone who believes that bisexuals aren't valid. Those are all inherently radical exclusionist beliefs. Radical exclusionists aren't accepted in the exclusionist community, and they are not claimed by us at all. If they were to try and get into the majority of our spaces, we would actively kick them out or silence them or ignore them and try and find spaces that are not full of radicals. Overall, being a radical is a bad thing. It means that you are willing to go to the extremes and do things that are not good things just to prove a point or to silence someone else. Or you believe something so extreme that it misrepresents everything that our community stands for. So, I would say, especially since we marginalize our own radicals, and our radicals are a very small group, considering that the exclusionist community is extremely tiny, that the point would go to exclusionists having the least amount of radicals. So ultimately, it comes down to 2 points to exclusionists and 4 points to inclusionists. So that goes to show that it would be much easier to be a part of the inclusionist community. But why are people a part of the exclusionist community? Well, because it's very difficult to become a part of a community that you know doesn't represent the truths that you've examined in your life. After coming through an entire process to find these results and to learn who you are and where your roots come from. It's very hard to be a part of an exclusionist community that says ignore that and just agree with whatever we say because that other information, don't worry about it. It's transphobic, it's envyphobic, it's homophobic, it's ableist, and they will throw any big word at it that they can just to continue living a more comfortable opinion set because it helps them feel more included. Even people that aren't a part of a marginalized group get to be a part of the LGBT community if you follow all inclusionist beliefs, which is why exclusionists exist. Normally, someone who starts off in the mainstream LGBT community, which is inclusionist by default, will realize that something that people are including is not something that makes any sense or should be included. With me, it was xenogenders and using gay as an umbrella term for the entire community. With a lot of people, it's one very specific issue that they see all around them. And you find that you get attacked en masse when you say anything about how you disagree with these things. Ultimately, you end up isolated and you find out about people who agree with your opinion, a very small user base of people who say, yeah, it's pretty weird that they include that. And that's safe. And that's how you figure out, oh, I've been in a community that's crazy this entire time, and I can be LGBT without being insane. And that is how exclusionists are born. We're not born out of a want to oppress others, or a want to please cisheads. Trust me, that's not in my scopes at all. It's out of true and utter disgust with how downhill the community has gone, and the complete isolation you get from voicing opinions against certain changes. Alright, thanks for listening. I appreciate that you watched my video. If you were to subscribe, it would be much appreciated, and I love you guys.